Hello and welcome to Warwick Business School's Core Insights podcast with me, Audrey Dias. Hello and welcome to Warwick Business School's Core Insights podcast, where we tackle the big issues facing business in the 21st century. My name is Audrey Dias and I'll be your host. In today's discussion, we take on the question, can behavioural science help us do better with our money? My guests are Neil Stewart, Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School, and Rafael Batista, who joins us from Chicago. Rafael co-founded the Behavioural Economics team at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Thank you both for joining me.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
So, if there's one word that comes across time and again in reading both of your work on this, it's nudge. Rafael, if I can start with you, can you tell me exactly what nudge is in this context and how banks are starting to use it to help customers?
Sure. So a nudge, I guess put very basically, is any aspect of one's environment that changes behavior in a predictable way without necessarily changing the choices you have in front of you, or kind of your ability to choose, or coercing you to choose anything in particular. And so kind of a very classic example is where you decide to put the fruit versus chocolate in a kitchen is a nudge. So if you put fruit kind of at eye level or kind of very visible, that leads you to be more likely to pick up fruit. And if you put the fruit in the back of the fridge, it's going to make it harder for you to pick out the fruit versus kind of where you put the chocolate. And so in both cases, you have fruits and chocolates available to you at any given point of the day. However, one is much more kind of in your face or easy to access. And that changes behavior in a pretty reliable way. And so that's a nudge. A nudge is kind of changes to one's environment that changes behavior. Now, of course, as we're becoming more digital, we're seeing nudges kind of being designed into our everyday environment, especially on digital platforms. And I think this is where a lot of kind of the banks today are innovating and trying to think about, well, what are the ways that we can kind of make things easier for our customers? What are kind of certain products or services or policies that we can kind of change in using behavioral insights to kind of better decisions for our customers? Of course, I think that there's a big question on what banks choose to nudge customers on and what they choose to make easy and not easy. But we can kind of talk through that as well. And so I think some examples of nudges are things like reminders. So reminders are a classic thing that most people wouldn't call a nudge, but I mean, by definition, it almost is. You're making something a little bit more top of mind. And therefore, people are more likely to act on it. And so simply sending a reminder to pay your credit card bill would be considered a nudge, right? And so,
Neil, if you want to pick up with what Rafael, do you agree with most of that? Or what is it that you found in your work?
I mean, as Rafael said, the key property of a nudge is it's something that changes in the environment that might cause you to change your behavior, but it doesn't really take your options away from you. You can still do whatever you like if you want to. And it's worth contrasting that with other ways that, say, governments or policymakers might try and change your behavior. So some things are just illegal. And if I do them, I go to prison. So or I'll get fined, something like that. Other things aren't illegal, but to make me do less of them, they just have a really high rate of tax on them. So I'm not allowed to murder people, and that's illegal, and I'll go to prison if I do that. But smoking is still legal. But to discourage me from smoking too much, it's just made really expensive by tax. So in that sense, a nudge is a really nice alternative route you can go down as a policymaker if you want to influence people's behavior, because it's often cheaper to implement, but it also doesn't restrict the freedom of your population. And in that sense, it's called libertarian. It still leaves people free to do what they want. Sometimes they're described as paternalistic because sometimes nudges are used to do things that are good, like make you eat healthy foods, make you take a little bit more exercise, those kind of things. And In that sense, they're often described as paternalistic because it's kind of what your mum and dad would want you to do if they could. That's what they've been trying to do to you for your whole life, is encouraging you to do those things, hopefully without making other things illegal or taxing you.
Rafael, I can see why this would be good for customers, but how is it good for banks as well?
Sure. So I think that there's often, if you think in the long term, I think this question is pretty straightforward. So I think things that are good for customers are good for banks, right? And again, especially in the long term, like if people are making more money and saving, having more financial health, they're depositing that money, they're investing that money, they're borrowing more. So I think in the long term, there's not really a question that things that are good for customers are good for banks. I think in the short term, it's a little bit trickier. And I think that there's often this perhaps a misconception that you need to trade off kind of things that are good for customers and things that are good for banks. And this belief kind of leads to maybe a corporate equivalent of what here in America we call a quick buck. So exploiting some loophole, or in this case, some sort of cognitive limitation that people may have, like limited attention or limited memory, to try and make a little bit more money and squeeze a little bit more money out of customers. Now, I think that's misguided. And I think that work that I've done and Neil's done kind of suggests that actually behavioral science offers an alternative way where you can both do good for your customers and good for the bottom line of a business. So I can talk through an example of a project that we worked on at my former company, where we chose to offer more information to customers. So I'll give you an example. If you look on any credit card website, pretty much anywhere in the world, you see all of the listed perks the credit card comes with. So whether that's travel rewards or traveler's insurance or no exchange fees, and the list goes on, and you can just see all the check marks that are next to these credit cards. Now, it makes it really hard for a consumer when all of the credit cards are so good. How do you choose the best credit card out of so many good credit cards? And of course, consumers aren't dumb. We know that there's often some sort of catch, or there's something that's being traded off in the background. Either that's higher fees somewhere else, or it's going to be lower interest rates somewhere. And so what we decided to do with some partners at Harvard Business School, Ryan Buell and Moon-Soo Choi, was to see, well, what would happen if we kind of showed a little bit of how the sausage is made and made it just as prominent, kind of the trade-offs that a consumer's making when they take up a credit card, as the perks. And so even today, if you look on the website of the Commonwealth Bank, you'll see credit cards listed with the benefits and the trade-offs. And we wanted to know, what does that do? How does that change consumers' choices? And how does that affect, of course, the bank's bottom line? And I think what we find is somewhat surprising. We run this randomized control trial, kind of the gold standard nowadays for testing how these things work. So similar to a medical trial, you might give some customers access to a certain page and other customers access to a slightly different looking page. And this is what we did here. And what we find is that when customers are provided kind of this transparency and the trade-offs with the credit cards, they actually take up the credit card at a similar rate as they did before. So the bank doesn't suffer in reducing the number of customers kind of taking up their products, which is surprising, because we're telling customers kind of, here's the things that you're going to give up. There's no travel's insurance on this card. This card offers a higher interest rate than some other cards that we offer, or this might not have, this has higher annual fees than some of the other cards. But not only did we not change the kind of acquisition rate, as they would call, or the number of customers taking up the product, but we actually see that customers are, in the long run, spending a bit more on their cards, which may lead you to think, well, if they're spending more, they might be more in debt. But we actually find that customers are not more behind on payments. So the number of people in arrears and kind of missing kind of their debt payments was equal between these two groups. And importantly, I think, again, for the bottom line, and we'll take this as evidence that it's good for the customer, there were fewer customers closing their accounts at the end of a 9-month period, which we take as being some suggestive evidence that people were more satisfied with their decision, that they were making a better decision overall. when provided with kind of this more transparent view, right? And that ultimately helps people choose.
Neil, some of your work that you've done is around not just that positive nudge, but also the negative nudge. And one of them is this minimum repayment figure on a credit card bill. Tell me about that impact and in terms of it on customer behavior.
So if you have a credit card, and I guess lots of people do, at the end of you spend money on it, and at the end of the month you get sent a bill, and you face the choice between you can pay off all of the bill now, in which case you won't pay any interest, or you can just pay off a little bit of the bill, some of the bill, half the bill, whatever you want, and whatever's left over will be carried over to next month, and there'll be interest added to it. Now, one of the problems with that is if you don't pay off any of the debt, then the balance gets carried over to the next month with interest, and the debt will, even if you don't do any more spending, the debt will grow and grow and grow. And also, you might with most loans, there's a mechanism there. So if I have a mortgage or take out a personal loan, we agree up front, this is what I'll pay back each month. And then often I'll set up a direct debit, or in America, I think it's called auto pay, but some automatic mechanism to make that payment for me. And so the minimum payment was introduced, and no one I've spoken to can quite remember exactly how it arrived, because it's been around for a very long time, but the minimum payment was introduced partly so that each month you pay off at least enough of your debt to cover the interest, so that the debt won't grow out of control with compounding interest. But also just to make sure that you sort of stay in touch with the company, and that you know it's a little reminder that the debt's still there. So what happens is at the end of the month, I get my credit card bill and it's got this minimum payment on it, and it will say something like, Neil, you owe £2,000. Maybe the minimum payment will be, I don't know, it's typically a few percent of the balance, so it will be maybe it'll be £50, something like that. And what we found is that although the minimum payment's there for largely positive reasons, to stop your debt growing out of control and to sort of keep you in touch with the company and keep the relationship ticking over, it has this unintended consequence of reducing how much you pay. And we call this anchoring. At least I think it's anchoring. Not certain of this anymore. But what's happening is you're saying, Neil, you owe £2,000. How about paying 50? And if that's how you read the minimum payment, then whatever I was thinking of paying is going to get dragged downwards towards 50. And indeed, in the laboratory, when we get people in and we ask them to play a game with us, a hypothetical task, we say, imagine you get this bill this morning, how much would you pay? And then for half of the bills, we present them as they would usually appear in real life with a minimum payment. And for the other half of the bills, we just don't tell people what the minimum payment is. What we find is that when we leave the minimum payment information off, people spontaneously say that they would repay more. So it seems like there's an unintended consequence of including a minimum payment on a statement. Yes, it protects all of the people who'd otherwise pay nothing and suffer compounding interest. But then for a lot of other people, it reduces the probability that you pay the bill in full. And if you only pay part of the bill, you tend to make a smaller payment. So it's like this minimum payment. And it's not been, when we've talked about nudges before, we've talked about things that people in the textbook, we call them choice architects, people who design the environment that we make our choice in. So it could be the cafeteria example that Rafael was talking about before. Someone has to choose where to put the apples and where to put the chocolate. And the person who takes that choice, they're the choice architect. They take that choice, and if they know about behavioral science, they would know, and probably if they just know about common sense, they would know that if you put the apples at the front, people will take the apples, and if you put the chocolate at the front, people will take the chocolate. With minimum payments, it was a bit more haphazard. I don't think anyone intended for there to be this unintended side effect, but there is. And it's probably costing people an awful lot, because if you repay less of your debt, then you pay interest on it. And that interest revolves over to the next month, and so on and so on. And indeed, unless you pay the bill in full, most people tend to make quite a smallish payment, above the minimum, but small nonetheless. And when you're making those small repayments, the way that the economics of compounding interest works is just paying a little bit more. So moving from £50 to £60 saves you a lot more money and time in debt than if you, say, moved from, I don't know, £150 to £160. It would make much less difference. So in that sense, and I think we can sort of understand it with hindsight, the minimum payment had this unintended consequence of reducing the repayments that perhaps most people make.
What do you think of that, Rafael? Was that one of the trade-offs that you think is very clearly put to customers?
I think so. Neil's work has obviously been so influential in this space, and I think for the most part, it's been found to kind of replicate. I think this finding that he's suggesting of anchoring is one that we see time and time again, kind of in various aspects of our life. I think one thing that I would add to Neil's piece is that as we work with organizations such as banks and larger companies that have a lot more data, one thing that really Neil's kind of at the forefront of is kind of seeing how these different nudges or applications of behavioral science differ for different groups of people. And I think that's kind of maybe this next frontier of behavioral science is one thing is to say, well, this thing affects people on average in this way. And as Neil was saying, for most people, it seems that we ran a similar study kind of applying some of these insights. And it seems that for many people, when you include that minimum payment, it does actually lead them to pay a little bit less than they otherwise would have. But there are groups of people for whom that minimum payment serves a very real purpose, because if all you have is maybe £50 at the end of your month and you need to decide where that goes to, knowing that £20 kind of gets you, avoids you some penalty with one of the institutions that you're with, that can go a long way, because you know that if I paid 19, I'd get the penalty, and 20, I wouldn't. And so again, kind of for some groups of people, those bits of information are really important. And now it's a challenge for folks like Neil and I, and the banks applying these insights to really use these insights in a very smart way, along with kind of the artificial intelligence or data analytics that a company might have, to then say, how do we target this so it helps the right consumers in the right way, right? So maybe I would add that bit, and I think we'll discuss a little bit more of this soon.
I think that's a really nice point, because I think where we're at the moment with sort of nudging people is we create some change in the environment. So maybe when we design a new building, we'll make sure the stairs are right opposite the entrance and the lift is off to one side, or the escalator's off to one side, and more people will take the stairs and they'll get the health benefit of walking up the stairs every day instead of taking the elevator. But that's very much a sort of one size fits all nudge. Everyone who comes through the doors is getting the same nudge experience of having the lift off to one side and the stairs right in front of them. But I think now institutions like banks, they know an awful lot about us. And in the olden days, I guess they used to segment their customers up with sort of market research categories. So if you know someone's age and their gender and maybe the beginning of their postcode, you can probably make guesses about what their life is like, because you can match in data from other people of similar ages and sexes and postcodes, and you can know a bit about them. I think now, though, we just know, like my bank knows everything I spend my money on. They can even work out when I'm awake, right? So if you know these things about a person, then there's the opportunity to describe to build like a really customized or bespoke nudge that would be targeted at basically at an individual customer. And so that, I think, is where the technology, if you like, might ultimately be going, would be to start designing nudges that are very much tailored to the individual.
Do we see, or do we think there may be a time when these ideas become commonplace in banking?
I think they might already be commonplace in banking, I would say. And in a sense, nudging is, two things to say here. So one is, nudging was popularized by a book by Thaler and Sunstein, and it's got a nice name, but actually lots of people have said, well, lots of nudging was going on before it was called nudging. For example, when you advertise something, and Rafael's already used the phrase top of the mind. When I see an advert on TV for something, typically it moves it to the top of the mind. I think about it a bit more, and that makes it a bit more likely that I'll buy it when I pop into the supermarket next. That's a kind of nudge. I guess we didn't used to call it nudging, we used to call it advertising. But so there's lots of things that might be in that nudge category that they weren't invented in 2008, I guess. And then the other thing is, I think behavioral science is quite a broad church. It's sort of typically the marriage of economics and psychology and data science together. That's a pretty broad coalition of on the academic side. And that means that nudging is really using those techniques. I mean, if you go to a bank, 20 years ago, you bump into economists quite a lot, and you'd bump into IT people. Now, if you go to a bank, you bump into data scientists and psychologists as well. They're all working together in the same building, and in that, and there's often, in a big retail bank, there'll be quite a lot of them, maybe hundreds of them on the staff. So in that sense, I think this is already commonplace in retail banking, at least, which is what I know about. Is that fair? I mean, you've got more experience of that, Rafael. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I echoing, I think what Neil's saying is that I think it's very common to find these days, at least in the top institutions, pretty much anywhere in the world, at least one person with the title of behavioral scientist, and probably many people who kind of are working or applying insights from books such as Nudge. I think that one of the things we're going to see more of, I hope, is some teams becoming more serious about the science part of behavioral science. And so what I mean by this is actually being at the cutting edge. So some of the organizations that Neil and I work with are literally producing new insights rather than simply consuming the insights that kind of exist in the world. And they're investing more in kind of research capabilities and development capabilities, including they're including experimentation in their platform. So this sort of A/B testing or these medical trials sort of things, like where you kind of are splitting up and trying out different web pages for different segments of customers. They're hiring experts kind of in this field and partnering with academics kind of trained in innovating in the space. And I think that that's less common. But I think we have some really good examples of organizations that are doing this much more regularly, and part of their strategic agenda. And so CEOs that are very attuned to this, I think will start reaping benefits very soon, if not already, as in some cases.
Will banks use some of these findings? I know that's something that, Neil, you touched upon. Do you see that individually catered, or more targeted service becoming something that could be something, that banks would take on? Or is that quite a long way away?
No, not a long way at all, I don't think. Banks kind of, a few years back, banks faced a choice. Do they want to be like a utility? Like I pay a company money each month and they put electricity and gas into my house or water into my house, and I use the electricity and gas and water. I don't really care about who I get electricity and gas and water from. They don't really care that it's me either, I suspect, because they're supplying exactly the same stuff down the same pipe, and they charge me for it and whatever. Banks used to kind of be like that, where I just go to a bank and they would provide me with a card and a checkbook in the olden days, and a way to, somewhere for my employer to put my salary, that kind of stuff. Contrast that with what, big tech companies do. Sometimes they provide a service to us, but they know an awful lot about us. And they use that information in the way that they provide the service. That's just totally normal. So they tailor adverts for me specifically based on the content of my email, for example. Or, if I Google buying a new microwave, then when I next watch YouTube, the advert in the middle is for a microwave, right? That's not coincidence. We know how that happens. And so banks have got that level of information about us. They can't see all my emails. They can't read all my social media posts, but they can see everything that I spend my money on. And to that end, they can build a picture of their customers, which is a sort of equal level of different, but an equal level of richness to the way that the tech companies can build a picture of us. And I think banks are keen to use that information to parallel what they've done before. I mean, basically, they just used to treat me as a particular age, a particular sex, a particular postcode, and a credit score, because they've got the credit scoring files, which tells me about my credit worthiness, whether if I borrow some money, will I pay it back or default on it in the next, I think it's 6 months, 9 months, something like that. Whereas now they know this much wider thing about us, and that I think they're using for two things. So one of them is they're using it to try and provide me with better products and services that are tailored to what I need. And I think certainly in the long term, there's an alignment between what's best for me and what's best for the bank. There's that shorter term issue that you raised, Rafael. But also, banks are changing the way they think about their purpose. They're not necessarily there just to make as much money for their shareholders as they can. A lot of banks talk now about having a social purpose, helping their customers thrive, or they'll talk about their customers' well-being. Maybe they'll talk about, for the benefit of the country, something like that. So, and a good example of that's a project I did recently with Lloyds Banking Group, which is one of the UK's largest retail banks. And what we did there was they have the issue that came up was gambling. And there's a sense that gambling might be fun for a lot of people, but might be problematic for a small number of people. And if you look at the way it's talked about, often we talk about problem gamblers, for example. But it's really hard to get a view of gambling. And in fact, because what you want to do is I want to be able to see, Audrey, I want to be able to see how much money you gamble, right? And I want to be able to see lots of other things about your life to see whether it's getting you into financial trouble, or you could get into, trouble with your personal relationships and family. You could get into trouble with your health, right? All sorts of different things. Who can see all of those things at once? Well, the gambling industry can't. They can see how much money you spend, and that's about it. They know a little bit more about you. The government can't see it because they don't know how much you personally spend on gambling, and they don't really know very much about your wider circumstances. But a retail bank can see that because they can see not only your spending on gambling, but they can see all of your other spending. And what we're able to do is for each person quantify, of all the money they spend each month, what fraction of it did they spend on gambling? And then we can look and see, did you miss a payment on your mortgage this month? Have you taken out a payday loan this month, which is, that's a sign that you really need money and can't get it from anywhere else. Have you, what other examples have I got? Have you, gone into your unauthorized overdraft on your current account? So we can get some sense of your financial well-being, and we can see that other things equal, the more you gamble, the more problem you get in. We can see how much you gamble each month, and we can see whether you miss your mortgage, whether you go into unauthorized overdraft, whether you take out a payday loan, and we can see in the data for millions of people. So we're not really interested in any one person. Indeed, the data we worked on was all sufficiently anonymized that we can't see that. But we can see that for every extra bit of money you gamble, you're more likely to miss a mortgage payment, default on your credit card, take a payday loan, go into unauthorized overdraft. And we can see that for millions of people. And actually the relationship's quite linear. It's not just at the very top end, the people who are gambling the very most, who've got the most financial harm associated with that gambling behavior. But even at the very lowest levels, people who are gambling very little, even if they gamble a bit more, they're a bit more likely to see those harms. And so that view of the sort of UK population, which a large retail bank would have, you can use it to answer some, if you like, a public health question. A policy question is, what should we do about gambling? And what we revealed is actually the harms are not confined just to a small fraction of people. And actually, there's probably a lot more harm than we thought there was associated with gambling. And then we can see that not just for your financial behavior, but for example, we can see you spend less money on, like, say, activities that involve another person. So we can see you spend less money playing tennis. And at the scaling that up at millions of people and across lots of activities, we can see that the more you gamble, the less likely you are to do sort of social activities that involve another person. We can see that you're more likely to be making transactions between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., where they're not automatic transactions, they're transactions where you have to type in the 3 digits on the back of your card or tap it, so we know you are awake to do the transaction. That means we know you're awake. And being awake in the middle of the night is one of the things that is associated with poorer mental health. So we can start to get an idea that the more people gamble, the more we can see that's associated with poorer mental health. And then we can look forward and backwards in time, because the bank has records of your financial behavior going over all the years you've been with them. So we can see, take a person who's employed now who gambles, are they going to be employed in the future? We can see if you're unemployed, you end up claiming benefits. The benefits come through your bank account. So we can see who's unemployed a few years out, and we can see that people who gamble more are more likely to be unemployed, or more likely to be claiming a benefit associated with a disability, or indeed even more likely to be dead. So the view that a retail bank has of that customer level view, where you can see the breadth of a person's life, you can use it to answer policy questions. For Lloyds Banking Group, that tied in with the work they were doing on trying to help their vulnerable customers with gambling. But it also lined up with the UK government revisiting the 2005 Gambling Act and has provided a new source of evidence that complements surveys of problem gamblers, it complements industry reports, it complements third sector, charities who help people who've got into trouble with gambling. It complements all that evidence. It gives us a new view on what's going on in the UK. So to that end, I guess you can bring the tools from behavioral science to bear on the kind of data that a bank holds and use that to develop something that's, it's helped Lloyds Banking Group thinking about their vulnerable customers, but it's also more generally of benefit to society because it can help us understand gambling and its effects on, the UK population. The bank has got such a large customer base that it's quite close to representative of the UK population. So I think we started off talking about nudging, and I've given an example there of how you can use the techniques from behavioral science to address a different problem. They're not nudging techniques, that's more data science, and then just using basic ideas from psychology and economics to understand how people behave. But that's the kind of thing that we can do when behavioral science meets an industry like the retail banking industry. We can do that broader kinds of things. And then the other thing I was going to mention is so we've talked about, we've got this broadening out to use behavioral science, but one of the other things that we bring is not just our domain knowledge about how people behave in different situations, but we also bring a skill set. And Rafael, you've already talked about randomized controlled trials or A/B testing and so on. I guess as behavioral scientists, we know a lot about how to run those trials. And it's only trials like that that let us truly say that one thing causes another. That's why for, say, vaccines, for example, we have randomized controlled trials. One wants to be sure that the vaccine is causing some improvement. And it's not just that things have improved as we rolled out the vaccine and that, those things have gone together, but one didn't directly cause the other. So that knowing about randomized controlled trials, and I think this brings us back to some of your work, Rafael, knowing about how to run a randomized controlled trial can also help retail banks take decisions about which of several things they might do.
Rafael, what would you like to add, if anything, to what Neil has just said?
Sure. So I think Neil is spot on. I think that in terms of will banks use these findings to kind of make services more targeted? I hope so, but I hope they use it for good, because you can imagine a darker kind of pattern that they choose to use this stuff for. But really, I think that we're seeing examples such as the stuff that Neil mentioned around gambling, where banks are using kind of the tools at their disposal and the data that they have on customers to try and explore some of these bigger problems that go beyond banking. So things to do with gambling, as Neil mentioned, but other things such as mental health, early onset of Alzheimer's, like being able to predict if people are kind of having mental fatigue in some way, if they're forgetting their passwords more often, if they're having more trouble kind of remembering what is in their accounts. We can also see things like domestic abuse or financial abuse. If one partner is spending a lot more of the other partner's money, or if they seem to have some control over the other partner's finances, we can typically see that in the data. We can see things like joblessness and when people lose their jobs, and things like homelessness or evictions, or if people are moving around very frequently, we can notice that in the data. And these things, they're not necessarily new. The banks have been tackling things like terrorism financing, which serve a public good, but also tend to be in the bank's interest. And I think that banks are starting to notice that there are some of these social problems that they're able to tackle, or at least kind of complement the government in being able to address many of these issues, or at least provide some visibility into where it's happening or when it's happening at this anonymized level, and be able to kind of support other initiatives that might exist in the world already to kind of better address these social problems. One example that kind of from our experience at Commonwealth Bank was taking this challenge, I think, that customers and constituents often have which is finding finding government benefits that may be available to them. So governments around the world, especially the very wealthy ones, have a lot of social services that they offer to their constituents. They have a lot of money set aside to kind of support people in certain times of need or times of not need. So if you have kids in many countries, for example, you can claim certain tax credits, or if you switch your refrigerator, you might be able to get another benefit for kind of going green. And these are kind of hard to find. You might not know where to look. You don't even know what to search for. Yet banks have tremendous amount of data on who you are and what your spending behaviors are, kind of the last time you purchased a refrigerator. And they can kind of help kind of connect you with these benefits that exist in the world. And so the Commonwealth Bank kind of took this initiative on, stemmed from the behavioral science team that I was a part of. And together with work of, again, some academic collaborators, Olivia Bergman, who's at my institution, Chicago Booth. And they ran a study where they made it easier to find benefits that you may be eligible for. And so they allowed you to opt in, again, kind of in the spirit of libertarianism. But they nudged you in a way to kind of say, hey, you might be eligible for this benefit. And this has been running now for a couple of years, kind of making it easier for customers to claim these benefits. And this past year alone, it seems that customers in Australia have claimed more than $500 million in government benefits that were already set aside for these purposes, but that people weren't using kind of as they were intended to. And I think the bank has played this interesting role in kind of supporting its customers, helping the government be more efficient in the delivery of its services. And at the end of the day, I think, truth be told, the customers who are better, again, in kind of their financial health are happier customers. If they're getting some rebate, they're likely to put that money in the bank's accounts. And so this is a win-win-win situation, I think, for a lot of people. And it stems kind of from these ideas of everyday psychology that Neil and I study.
Time now to ask you for 5 recommendations that could help shed further light on our topic today.
Yeah, sure. So I think my list of recommendations, I'll pull from some a bit older and some newer works, most of them behavioral science, but some of them not. So I think that we'd be remiss to kind of not mention Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in this space in 2002, and the book came out in 2011. So I think that inspired me to kind of get into this field and later meet Neil. And so I would certainly recommend that. So another book is How to Change by Katie Milkman, who's a brilliant behavioral scientist at Wharton, and has just come out with this book a couple months ago. And so I'd recommend that kind of. And there's kind of these fun examples and really insightful pieces of how you can apply behavioral science kind of in your own life, but also in organizations. She does a lot of work there. Scarcity by Sendhil Nathan and Eldar Shafir is another book I typically recommend because it kind of gives a new perspective on how to think about kind of poverty and the psychology of poverty and how kind of being in the state of poverty can not only make life more difficult kind of in your everyday finances, but it also deeply affects kind of the way we think about our everyday decisions. And there's some terrific insights that I think are important for both policymakers as well as business people to kind of better understand how people in these circumstances will make decisions. I think another book that, and then let me add my last behavioral science book is Nick Chater's The Mind is Flat, which I'll admit is probably somewhat of an unconventional view on psychology, but is one that is incredibly eye-opening and kind of inspires a lot of curiosity in the way we tend to think about ourselves. And then one book that is not technically a behavioral science book, but I've enjoyed quite a bit over the past year is Where Good Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson, which in talking about kind of organizations and banks and kind of thinking a little bit outside the box, this book does a terrific job at kind of suggesting how we might make changes to our everyday environment. So similar to the nudge conversation we were having earlier, but how do we change our environment to kind of inspire new innovation and new ideas? And I think that it complements maybe some of these other books quite well. So those would be my 5.
We should also talk about Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein. I guess, given the beginning of our conversation, we can't have that on the list.
And they're coming out with a new edition, the final edition in a few months. So,
and a book by a chap called Dan Ariely, Predictably Irrational. And I guess perhaps Thinking Fast and Slow, Nudge and Predictably Irrational in some mix sort of popularized behavioral science. And those books came out at about the time the retail banks were hiring people into these positions. And they were very influential, I think, in getting behavioral science as far into industry as it is now. So I think we've got to suggest those books. But I've got one here, and I'll hold it up to the camera just because I carry it around everywhere with me. This is The Art of Statistics by a statistician called David Spiegelhalter, Sir David. And well, if you've been following COVID-19 vaccine and mortality and so on numbers, he's been a voice of reason and clarity in explaining how they work in the UK. But his job is in communicating statistics for the public to understand. This is not a core behavioral science book, but behavioral science is it's really heavily based on numerical analysis of, in the examples we've been talking about, large data sets held by retail banks. If you've not been trained up in that, then The Art of Statistics is a really great book to understand how it is we can make sense of the world around us using numbers. What it means, what is good evidence to take a decision, which is often why people come to behavioral science and want to use it in industry. So I'll hold it up again. The Art of Statistics. I think that's absolutely essential reading.
That's all for today's episode of this podcast. Thanks to my guest, Neil Stewart, Professor of Behavioural Science here at Warwick Business School, and Rafael Batista, who played a leading part in encouraging banks to use behavioural science for the good of their customers. Thank you for joining us, and I'll be back soon with another episode of this Core Insights podcast. For now, though, stay safe and goodbye.